What's going on, everyone? I'm meteorologist Mike Linden, joined by meteorologist Matthew Cappucci. We are live in the MyRadar studio here in Orlando, Florida. Of course, we are talking about Tropical Storm Ian. That is the talk of the town, and it is expected to strengthen here over the coming days, reaching major hurricane status. We have got you covered across all of our social media platforms. So if you're watching on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, or even LinkedIn, be sure to let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you have any questions, we will get to them over the course of the stream. We might even have some fun little giveaways coming up as well. But Matthew, let's waste no time. Let's jump right in. As it stands right now, Tropical Storm Ian is intensifying as it begins its turn northward.
That it most certainly is. You know, it's starting to kind of come together right now. Here's the latest high-resolution infrared satellite. And you see all these colors, the reds, the purples, those signify very tall, cold cloud tops. So we're seeing more convection or shower and thunderstorm activity. But notice, you know, there's no real concentrated center quite yet. If you look right down here near this kind of convective burst, there's a hint of a swirl near the surface. But ultimately, until we have a cohesive low-level vortex, we can't really say with certainty where this thing's kind of anchored. We take a look at visible satellite. Here we see right here, notice towards the end of the loop, yeah, look at that swirl really beginning to manifest. Now, if it's like a naked swirl with no convection nearby, no shower and thunderstorm activity, then it's not too intense. But look at this, right towards the end of the loop, in like the final, say, 3-4 seconds, so really like the past hour or so, we're seeing one big thunderstorm just west of the center, one hot tower, so to speak, that is wrapping around and will eventually work northwards. So that's what we're seeing right now. And again, that's what we have to kind of pay attention to. So the hurricane hunters flew in this earlier on. They were looking for a center. And indeed, notice the wind bars kind of wrapping around like that. So we're beginning to see that full center really take place. Kind of like playing pin the tail on the donkey. You got to be able to figure out where to pin that. So in this case, that's what we did. So now that we sort of know where this thing is centered, there's a better chance our modeling will improve in the future. You probably heard us talk about the American model, the GFS, the European model. There's still sort of differences in between what the two models are outputting for where the storm will ultimately go in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's why we have to have people fly into these things with aircraft to figure out what the innards of the storm are like. Now, regardless, no matter how you slice it, this thing's going to rapidly intensify over the northern Caribbean. Because look at this, purple, water temperatures 85 to 90 plus degrees. That's like bath water down over the Gulf of Mexico as well, Florida Straits. So really, anytime you have a hurricane in this area, with these kind of atmospheric conditions, it's like a powder keg. Basically, at this point, it's like lighting off fireworks inside a tent. You know something explosive is going to happen. You might not know exactly where it's going to go, but you know someone is going to get hit. The question is who. Now, these past few days, it's been struggling. Now it's sort of entering a time when it's really going to be able to manifest quite intensely as a higher-end hurricane. The reason being, upper-level outflow is going clockwise, kind of like this. Now, what does that mean? Well, outflow is exhaust from a storm. And what's happening is at the upper levels, this exhaust air is fanning away from the system. The system is breathing a little bit, but it's being helped by this upper level clockwise flow, or this upper level high that is spinning in the same direction. So hurricanes in the northern hemisphere spin counterclockwise at the surface. They take in air like this. Then that goes up in the middle, kind of like a chimney, so in the eye wall, the intense thunderstorms near the center of the storm, and eventually kind of unwinds aloft like this. The more that goes out, the more that can come in the bottom. It's just like if you're going to have a fan blowing at the top of a chimney, sucking air up out of the chimney. What's going to happen? More air goes in the bottom of the chimney where the fire is and fans those flames, making it more intense. Same thing here. So this is really helping to evacuate air from the top of the storm, like a vacuum-like effect, causing more air to rise from the bottom, causing a more intense storm. This, coupled with those water temperatures, that is a recipe for rapid intensification. That's what we're forecasting these next 36 to 48 hours before this thing makes landfall in Cuba sometime late Monday into early Tuesday, and really beyond, as it heads north of Cuba as well. So really concerning signs there. Ultimately, steering flow will take it sort of up this way into western Cuba, or just barely towards the peninsula over here, so something to watch. So what are we expecting? This model suggests that by early tomorrow morning, notice the time stamp, 5 a.m., by early tomorrow morning, we could be talking a decent hurricane really beginning to come together, okay? Notice, by the way, impacts extend far outside of where this main core of energy is. So these spiral rain bands, these can be problematic. Very heavy rainfall, flash flooding within some of those, mudslides possible too. So look, even though the storm center may track near or just offshore of western Cuba, notice a couple rain bands. Even up in like the Keys, we could see rain bands as early as late tomorrow night. And then really, this thing's like an atmospheric buzzsaw. This model, the IBM graph, actually suggests maybe an annular cyclone. What that means, it's like one solid ring of heavy convection with lesser in the way of feeder bands outside. So these things are a little bit smaller. They stay stronger for longer, though, if they are an annular cyclone. And also, they kind of fluctuate in strength much more, too. So something to watch there. This thing rapidly intensifies all the way into southern or western Cuba. Look at that. Tomorrow, or rather Tuesday morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, this could be really bad down there. About 130 mile an hour winds in the eye wall right here. The eye, that donut of comets, an oasis of comets, a very strange place to be. Eventually that crosses Cuba, but here's the thing. Cuba is a rather narrow island. It's only about, say, 50, 60 miles south to north, so this thing doesn't realize it's over land because by the time it starts to weaken, oh wait, it's north of that. It's in the Gulf of Mexico once again, and the Gulf, as we talked about, is another area that will be a breeding ground for a very high-end strong storm. So our models have shifted east a little bit today. They're now suggesting this will come ashore in western Cuba, hop on over Cuba, and then look, there's a huge range anywhere from Tampa Bay, the Caloosahatchee River, Naples, Sarasota, Fort Myers, all the way up into the Big Bend area and eventually be Panhandle too. So we're just not really sure at this point what will happen. So why is there all this uncertainty? An unusual amount of uncertainty for this time frame. Comes down to this. Now this might look like a bucket of spilled paint. Here's our setup. We got this dip in the jet stream within which is nestled cool air, low pressure, and spin at the high altitudes. But this dip is like a highway. All those strong winds will start tugging this storm northwards. The question is, how intense is that dip and where's the position of it as we head towards the midweek? This is the American GFS model. It's saying, hey, our storm down here, this low of vorticity or spin, i.e. the hurricane, misses its ride. And as a result, it just kind of keeps heading northwards into Florida as a weaker storm. The European model, on the other hand, says, hey, much more intense dip like this. Watch our storm sneak in. It starts feeling the effects of this trough, and it's dragged farther east into central or western Florida on the west side, the Gulf side, of course, and then kind of heads inland like that. So really, big wild card still, only about 3-ish days out. The other thing to note, with the American GFS model, the earlier simulation we talked about, this trough, winds out of the north, dragging down dry air, and the pernicious winds with heights, remember the strong winds aloft, would be disruptive to the storm if it keeps heading north. So in the GFS scenario, yeah, it heads farther north as a weaker storm, likely a Category 1 when it makes landfall, as it entrains dry air. The European model suggests this thing will kind of stay a self-contained ball of moisture and impact Florida before feeling the effects of the dry air and the strong winds aloft. So again, something to watch there. As for where you should be concerned, here's kind of what we're thinking right now. Obviously, western Cuba, kind of ground zero for this storm at this point. Unfortunately, winds like 130 plus miles an hour. Then, you know, the risk is increasing across western Florida, the Big Bend, a little bit less now in the western panhandle, still like the Tyndall Air Force Base area, not Titusville's over there, Panama City. Those areas right here, need to watch that really here all the way down like the Caloosahatchee River. I'd say kind of the goalposts for this system, but regardless, it's something we really have to watch. So again, here's what we were seeing earlier on. And Mike, actually, if we can switch on over to the National Hurricane Center's cone, well, that'll show folks sort of the latest cone at 5 o'clock. I think I forgot to throw that in my lineup. Yeah. But here we take one more look at that convection. The cool thing, so this is actually the GOES East Weather Satellite, 22,234 miles above the ground. It is peering down at the surface, and as the sun goes down, remember, the sun is lighting this from an angle. We can start to see the cloud tops, these overshooting tops from the hurricane. That's what you're seeing right there. So again, you know, notice all that roiling convection. It's impressive to see these very tall clouds right towards the middle too. So that's kind of what we're seeing right now. So again, we'll take a look at that latest cone from the National Hurricane Center and see what we can get if we switch graphics real quick or switching over.
I've got it right here in the app, actually.
Awesome, yeah, so even better, we'll take a look inside the app. Here's what we're thinking. We've noticed that the National Hurricane Center, in accordance with the latest models, is shifting things farther east. So notice right there, we have that M. You can just barely see a 3 north of north of Cuba, and then of course a 4 in the southeastern Gulf. So pretty concerning there, and we have to watch this pretty closely as it charges towards the northern Gulf of Mexico and eventually impacts Florida. So Mike, a lot that we're busy tracking. So
latest update here coming in around 5 o'clock. We have the first tropical storm watch that has been issued for portions of the continental United States. This is in effect for the Florida Keys. Mind you, this is preventative with Ian working its way northward. You can see that it is in effect with southeastern winds between 30 and 45 knots, upwards of 60. The real key there are the seas as high as 10 to 15 feet. So while not taking a direct impact here from Ian, or at least as it stands right now, you're talking about a Category 3 major hurricane just off the western coast of the Florida Keys. Mind you, we are live across all of our social media platforms right now. I see the comments rolling in here, so be sure to get your questions in. Cappucci and I are going to be live here really as long as we can continue to go for. And if you've ever seen Mr. Cappucci there on camera, you know that if we just left the camera running, he might be able to go all the way through the rest of the week here. But again, I'm in the MyRadar app here. This is the hurricane tracker feature. You can turn that on by going into the layers menu and going right into hurricane tracker. Really great feature that we have too is the wind speed forecast. So I'm going to turn this one down here, but you can see that again, those tropical storm force winds expected to arrive in the Florida Keys over that 12-hour period on Tuesday, beginning around 8 or so a.m. and lasting through the evening hours. But as we head into the middle portion of the work week, as Ian begins to work its way toward the Big Bend, that is where we could see those winds working their way back into the real meat of the state of Florida. So again, Cappucci, it is a situation that is developing really quickly, and we've continued to see this track continue to seemingly be all over the place, kind of splitting the difference here between the GFS and the European model. So what are your expectations here as we're beginning to work our way forward? Again, you've got the high-resolution satellite turned on there. No real center to Ian just yet, but boy, is it trying to do so here.
Yeah, you know, we're seeing an unusual amount of uncertainty for this far in advance, or rather this close to when the storm's actually expected to make landfall. We're only like 3 or 4 days out from potential impacts here in Florida, of course. MyRadar is located in Orlando, but the better risk would be farther west on the Gulf Coast. But really, the fact that we can't narrow anything down beyond, say, the Big Bend, all the way down to the Caloosahatchee River, and we've seen so much wiggling back and forth with the models, is pretty unusual. Now, the National Hurricane Center is kind of splitting the difference, as you said, between the American GFS model and the European model, which, you know, kind of makes sense. I think the tricky thing at this point is I'm betting on either model to win. I don't really think there'll be too much of an in-between. Some models, like the United Kingdom model, and of course the Canadian model too, actually the German model as well, are beginning to favor more of the European model solution. The American GFS is trending farther eastwards as well. But that said, there's just so much in the way of irregularity, and some of our hurricane models are very specific models that deal only with the hurricane and how it fits into the surrounding atmosphere. So like the HMON and the HWRF, as we talked about earlier on, they're forecasting this thing to head closer to the Big Bend. So we still honestly have no idea, and personally, I think this uncertainty comes to where is the center. On infrared, again, it's really tough to find that center. We just unfortunately can't right now, and until we really locate that, we won't know where it's going. For anyone who's like, I don't want to say old, but anyone who's older than me who remembers The Price is Right, you remember that game Plinko. So the way Plinko worked was you drop a chip and it would hit a nail. It could go either direction from that nail, and it would fall to one more level of nails, and then in either direction it could go again. So it was a product of sort of random variability. Each time it had a 50% chance of going one way and another way, and with each iteration, the degree of randomness continued. Same thing's kind of happening here. Imagine, say, for example, in meteorology, we used to have this expression called the drunken wanderer, and essentially, let's say, for example, you had someone standing at one point, and they randomly took a step in one direction, and they randomly took a step in another direction, and they kept doing this, kind of like the Roomba vacuum cleaner. You'd be able to see, probabilistically, as you get farther away from that starting point, the odds of it going there are much lower because there's so much more randomness. Same thing here. So we might start with a small discrepancy. One model might say, hey, the center's here. Another model might say the center's here. But ultimately, the steering currents could take those two starting points in completely, vastly different directions, and we just wouldn't really know because, you know, there's so much randomness that grows over time. So that's kind of the concern right now. I do love watching this high-resolution satellite shot from the GOES East Weather satellite. Again, maximum winds near the center of circulation, around 45 miles an hour at this point. But notice, there's not a ton of convection or thunderstorm activity east of the center right over here until this starts to fill in, which it's beginning to farther east, but until we have these hot towers, so to speak, fully wrap around, I think this thing will be kind of held at bay. That said, it's moving over an extremely favorable environment right now, so I do think this will begin its rapid intensification quite soon. One thing to note, See how these thunderstorms are getting going just west of the center? Here's the center, obviously, right here. That's the low-level center. If one of these storms moves over the low-level center and pulls that updraft, vertically stretches it, suddenly you have a beautiful anchor point around which the entire storm will start to fill in and really develop. So that's kind of what we're watching right now. The National Hurricane Center had their Hurricane Hunter aircraft with the Air Force fly into the storm earlier on. And here's kind of what they found. The broad circulation looking like this. All these wind bars kind of wrapping around one point, pressure of 1003 millibars. So we're beginning to see a decrease in air pressure, but also it looks like there's a center trying to form. When we say a decrease in air pressure, essentially this storm is lifting air up and evacuating it outwards, so there's less weight of the atmosphere on top of someone if they were standing right in the middle because there's less air on top of them. That's actually what spurs hurricane force winds to begin with. Hurricanes are like when you swirl coffee. When you have your spoon swirling your cup of coffee, the faster the fluid spins, the bigger that dip can grow in the middle. Same thing with a hurricane. The deeper that depression, the more air wants to rush in to fill that void, but the air is spinning, so it can't do that. So we introduced something called cyclostrophic balance. Essentially, it's a crazy term, but it just basically means the dip, the extent to which air wants to rush in to fill the void, has to be balanced by how quickly the air is spinning around and forced outwards. So that's why the air can go around and around and around and around. That's kind of what's happening inside any of these storms. So like we said, the bigger the dip, the more the drop off in air pressure. Ambient air pressure should be about 10-15 millibars. So the bigger the drop off, the more missing air there is, the bigger the dip in the atmosphere, and the stronger the winds rushing in to fill that dip. Kind of cool lesson there. But yeah, you learn something new every day. Cyclostrophic balance. Anywho, so this thing will get going. We have crazy water temperatures in the northeastern Caribbean. Look at that. Purple. So that means water temperatures like 90 degrees. Florida Straits, same exact thing. A very favorable environment over here for continued rapid intensification, even after it intensifies and moves over Cuba into the Gulf. The other thing to note too, in the upper levels, look at this, clockwise flow. Now every hurricane swirls in air at the low levels in a counterclockwise manner. That air rushes up in the eye wall and eventually kind of unwinds like this in a clockwise manner. So this pre-existing high pressure, wrapping clockwise, will cause the unwinding to go even better. What that means is this will enhance upper level exhaust or outflow, air exiting the storm, and the more air we evacuate from the top, the more air can rush in the bottom. Just like if you're putting a fan on top of a chimney, that'll kind of blow air up and out of the chimney. That'll suck air in the bottom too, because of course things have to be continuous, so that will cause bigger flames in the chimney. Same thing here, we're kind of fueling the fire, so to speak, by venting the storm aloft. That's what we're seeing right there. So by early tomorrow morning, we got this donut beginning to take shape on the simulated radar. Look at that eye really beginning to take shape as well by Monday afternoon into the early evening hours. This thing becomes a buzzsaw as it impacts western Cuba. And look right there, all these purples, this annulus of winds we call the eye wall. That is the donut of fury. The winds drop off markedly outside. So over here you might have winds of like 40 miles an hour, 60, 70, 80, 90, and then like right in this donut, that's where you get the 130, 140 mile an hour wind gusts. I've been inside the eye wall of storms before, and I can tell you, that eye wall, when it comes in, you know it. Might not last too long, hour in each direction, once you get the first eye wall, the eye, and the second eye wall. But really, the eye wall is the area of fury. Might only be like 30, 40 miles wide. Picture like a 40-mile wide EF3 tornado plowing through. Western Cuba will see a significant impact, and there again you see that oasis of calm inside the storm. That is what we call the eye, where air is sinking and kind of squashing cloud cover. So models are beginning to say, hey, this thing will actually move across western Cuba. Initially, it looked to miss it to the west. Now it'll move across western Cuba, but Cuba is so thin that it doesn't weaken much over land, and as a result, it starts working north. Then we see right around, I'd say late Tuesday, early Wednesday, bam, this huge spread in the model. Some say this thing's coming ashore near the Caloosahatchee River. Others say Tampa Bay. Others still say Panama City Beach. A huge range. If it comes ashore across the northern Gulf, it would be a much, much, much weaker storm undergoing rapid weakening. Not to discount it fully. It could still have a storm surge, still some gusty winds, but a much weaker storm versus if this took a turn earlier on, headed straight towards Tampa. So really, the jury is still out. The reason being, the upper air pattern is still a little bit uncertain. Here's the American GFS model. It says there will be this dip in the jet stream, this trough, within which will be nestled cold air, low pressure, and spin at the high altitudes. This thing may not give a ride to our hurricane down here. So here, GFS says those two won't link up, and so as a result, this hurricane can just kind of keep charging on, slowly weakening as it heads towards the northern Gulf, because the tug, the river of winds at the upper levels, moves away farther east, whereas the European model looks more like this. This dip, a little bit stronger, a little bit deeper, will capture this storm and tug it east into western central Florida. So again, a lot of uncertainty still for only about 3 days to 72-ish hours out from when this storm may impact western Florida, if that is the case. The other thing to know, too, why are we expecting rapid weakening if the American GFS model verifies? Well, here's our dip. This dip of the strong winds aloft, A, the strong winds would tear apart the storm as it approaches the northern Gulf. B, dry air is wrapping into the storm because keep in mind we have northerly winds on the backside of that dip. That would entrain into the storm and cause a gradual weakening too, whereas the European model says no, if this thing hits central Florida, it would sort of escape that shear first, that changing winds with height, which is kind of pernicious to the system, and also it would be only after pushing through Florida that it really suffered from the dry air. So ultimately, we want anyone across really the orange zone right here, maybe even the yellow too, to be paying close attention to this. I think the bigger risk right now, obviously, western Cuba, that'll be ground zero, that'll be kind of the face of this disaster. But the question is, does this curve a little farther east and affect the mid-coast of Florida on the western side, the Gulf side, or does it stay like this as the storm weakens heading towards a Big Bend? Mike, ultimately at this point, we just don't know, but there's a ton of uncertainty to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has been a developing situation. You know, I'm seeing people in the comments here saying it seems like they really can't make up your mind. Forecasting is difficult, let alone for the folks at the National Hurricane Center, effectively the Navy SEALs of tropical meteorology. So believe me, they are doing the best they can, and as are we, to make sure that you guys are alerted to changes in the forecast. Of course, we will have continued coverage across the week as this storm continues to develop. I mean, once this thing enters into the Gulf of Mexico, that's where things get really interesting. Bear in mind that even if you really can't get hung up necessarily on whether it's a Cat 1, 2, 3, and so on, you certainly need to be prepared. If you do live along the western coastline of Florida, extending northward into the Panhandle, even for folks that live in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, you could certainly be dealing with some violent storm surge here over the next couple of days. Of course, storm surge is water where you don't necessarily want it to go. So again, you need to be prepared. You still have plenty of time to do so. We are still, again, as you can see, looking at the real center of Ian being still well south of Cuba. I'm seeing a lot of folks in the comments here asking whether or not Jamaica will be affected. Now, this is beginning to work its way west of Jamaica if you look at the app here. But boy, there's a lot of rain stretching from coast to coast, from Montego Bay and Negril all the way eastward to Kingston. Again, the real center, quote unquote, of Ian is still working its way north and northeast. But again, for folks that live in Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, and of course, as Cappucci just touched on there, western Cuba, certainly need to be prepared for this storm to arrive. We're still, again, looking at this western portion of Cuba just to the west of Havana. Havana not in the cone, but just one little nudge in either direction, whether it's west or east, and you could see this cone shift fairly dramatically. Again, the folks at the National Hurricane Center have done their best here to make sure that this is as accurate as possible. I'm seeing a ton of comments here coming in here. So again, let us know where you're watching from. If you have a question for myself or for Cappucci, just get it in the chat here. I've got it all pulled up in front of me, whether it be YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and on LinkedIn as well. And hey, to our folks watching on Twitch as well. All right. I should also add that if you follow us on Twitter, you can see it somewhere on the screen. We'll pop it up on the screen in just a moment. Big shout out to Damien pulling the strings in the back there. At MyRadarWX, that's MyRadarWX on Twitter. We are so close to 100,000 followers. Follow us and send us a DM and let us know where you're watching from, and we will be reaching back out to you. We will give a few lucky winners a really neat prize. That guy behind me here, you can see me just behind me, he wrote a book. So we are going to be giving away a couple copies of his book. Might be autographed. Hey, we'll see. So again, be sure to follow us on Twitter at MyRadarWX. Send us a DM. Let us know where you are watching from. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions coming in, Cappucci. We've got someone on YouTube asking about South Florida. What will Miami experience? Of course, these folks are not strangers to tropical weather in the slightest bit. But if you look again at that cone on the MyRadar app, it's still west of it, but that does not mean that you're necessarily out of the woods, so to speak. You could still be looking at some rather nasty weather heading your way.
Yeah, most definitely. We want to make sure that folks know that they don't have to be inside the cone to see impacts. The cone only represents historical error from the National Hurricane Center. So really, anyone inside the cone, yes, you could see the kind of the brunt of the storm, but even outside the storm, there will still be impacts because this thing could be a rather large storm. For example, if the center tracks right here, there's still a chance tropical storm force winds could push all the way towards the Keys, all the way into southwest Florida, the Everglades, towards places like Immokalee, Fort Myers too, and really inland as well, towards really central Florida. So again, tropical storm force winds at 39 miles an hour or greater are possible. So you can see here, for example, 20, 30 miles an hour for anyone in the yellow eastwards. The orange will be about 40 miles an hour plus. So it's really sort of relegated to the coastline for the strongest winds, but keep in mind, hurricanes can be wide, so they could be pushing water against the coastline. So the Keys, you could see a bit of a surge there, say 1, 2, 3 feet. Key West only averages about 3 feet above sea level, so there could be flooding there too. That's why we have to take this seriously, even if we are outside of the cone of concern as well. The other thing I really want to note, we talked about this storm, perhaps if it goes in northern Gulf route, perhaps weakening. So the category may not be all that impressive. Floridians, they've been through hurricanes before. The one thing I really want to emphasize with this, though, is that the category does not tell you anything about the impacts other than wind. And wind is one of the smallest elements of tropical cyclones. We got surge, we got flooding rains, we got tornadoes. All those things would be possible with this system, too. So let's say, for example, it does take this path. The storm is spinning counterclockwise like this, so east of the center, winds are out of the south. Okay? That would push water against the coastline, and the Big Bend of Florida over here, Big Bend, so roughly like Tampa Bay northwards through the Big Bend, eventually the Panhandle too. This is one of the most susceptible places in all the Gulf of Mexico for storm surge. So even a low-end storm, what in terms of headlines may look like a high-end tropical storm, low-end hurricane, could still produce like a 4 to 6 foot storm surge because the slope of the continental shelf and the bathymetry, or the shape of the seafloor, is shallow enough and sloped just gradually enough that it's basically pushing water like a ramp into the coastline. So that could be a problem there too. The other thing, way down the road, if we take a look back a few graphics, you'll be able to see, the interesting thing with this storm is if it eventually moves over the southeast in a weakened state, remember at that point, as likely a tropical storm, kind of losing tropical characteristics, next weekend in like Georgia and the Carolinas, if it continues northwards too, it could eventually bring remnant rainfall into portions of, for example, Georgia, South Carolina. Might even see some few gusty squalls too, a couple isolated tornadoes mixed in as well. So really, there are a wide range of possibilities with this, but we take a look at that cone on the MyRadar app, as we'll see momentarily. We'll flip that up for you just so you can take a look at it. And we emphasize that you are beginning to see the cone in the Carolinas. If we pull that up real quick, we zoom in a little farther north, goes into northern Georgia and just barely into South Carolina. So, Mike, at that point, it likely won't be a hurricane farther inland, but here's the thing. I've been in Washington, D.C. before, and a tropical rainstorm spawned tornadoes there too. So when these things come ashore, yeah, they drop all their rainfall, heavy rainfall. They might be losing their winds, but the upper levels, there's still enough wind that we get changing winds with height that can brew issues with tornadoes. So, a multifaceted threat. Threats do not stop at landfall. They keep going well after landfall.
Not in the slightest bit. Bear in mind that these gigantic heat engines, their fuel is warm water. So once they work their way inland, you will see that weakening, and you are seeing that here on the cone from the NHC, going from a Cat 2, just on the brink of a major hurricane there off of the coast of Florida, weakening to a tropical storm. But as Cappucci said, the winds are only a small part of the story here. Storm surge, heavy rain, flash flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes bring quite a bit of activity. Again, I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in here on our chat. Our numbers continue to go up, which is great. Get your questions in. We will stay with you here for quite a bit longer. And hello to the people watching on Twitch. What's up, folks? A couple people watching in Florida. That's awesome. All right, so we have another question here. Let me pull it up, Mr. Cappucci here. So people are asking, of course, about the western coast of Florida, being that they are in the cone. The Gulf side of Florida certainly does not deal with hurricanes all that often, at least making landfall on that side of the state. Yep. We've got a few folks asking about Fort Myers and Tampa, looking at what the possible damage will be. Again, it's hard to say necessarily offhand what you'll see until we get a bit closer, but again, what we know historically, when these kinds of winds work their way inland, you're going to be dealing with quite a few factors. Again, the storm surge, which we'll know a lot more of as we get a lot closer to that potential landfall. And then, of course, dealing with the heavy rain as a result of this system working its way inland. Seeing some people asking whether or not they should postpone their trip to Disney World. I mean, ultimately, that's going to be up to you and up to the mouse there, what they're going to do at the most magical place on earth. But nonetheless, you should be prepared. The great expression for this time of year is fail to prepare and then prepare to fail. You need to make sure that, again, you have food, water, again, non-perishable foods for at least up to 3 days if you were to lose power. And I have it right here with me, just off camera here. I'll show you. I love this thing. This is a mobile power bank. If you were to lose power in your home, you need to be able to reach emergency services. Or again, if you need to be able to look at the MyRadar app to see where this thing is going, these things could really be a lifesaver for you, making sure that your lifeline is fully charged up. I can't recommend those enough. And again, you still have plenty of time to prepare. If you have pets at home, it's always a great time to make sure that your pets are taken care of as well. Again, food for up to at least 3 days. But Cappucci, again, Tampa, Fort Myers, St. Petersburg, and even up northward toward the Panhandle, these are the areas where you're not typically seeing landfall from a hurricane or a tropical storm all that often. So what can folks here expect?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges with this system is that even, say, 3 or 4 days out, we normally start having a better idea as to where it's going. But Mike, the uncertainty is through the roof with this one. That's really the most frustrating part as a forecaster. We know right now, over the next 24 to 36 hours, it will rapidly intensify en route to Cuba and eventually impact the western portion of the island well west, about 4 or 5 hours west of Havana. But watch what happens. After this eye moves through, a couple things happen. Number one, it doesn't really get disrupted all that much by land. The eye might widen a little bit. That sometimes happens when storms pass over land or islands, but that would actually expand the wind field a little bit. At the same time, it will be rapidly intensifying. And because Cuba is only like 40 or 50 miles from south to north, this thing will not weaken all that much. By the time it realizes it's over land, it'll already pass back into the Gulf of Mexico, where it can continue rapidly intensifying thanks to those crazy warm water temperatures. Now, we look at our spaghetti models, and they show an unusual kind of bifurcation or a split around 72 hours in. We see some say, hey, this one will keep going towards the northern Gulf, for example, Panama City Beach, up in the Panhandle. Others focusing towards the Big Bend. Others still, though, about 3 or 4 of them, curve it right into Tampa or towards like Homosassa Springs. So the fact that we have all this model variability this close to the predicted landfall, so like 3-ish days out, shows that this is a very unusual setup where we have 2 competing forces that could be playing a tug of war with this system. So really, what is the upper air setup and why is this such a tough forecast? Well, the American GFS model shows this dip in the jet stream kind of shaping up like this. This is our hurricane down here. The GFS kind of misses them, meaning they don't really link up all that much. So the storm misses its ride, misses being tugged eastwards, and just keeps pushing north into the northern Gulf. The European model, on the other hand, says this hurricane, as it pushes north of Cuba, does feel the jet stream, gets tugged northeast by it, and pulled into the west coast of Florida, which would have vastly different impacts because, number one, it won't really be weakening all that much yet. So this would be like a Wednesday time frame in western Florida, or if the GFS, the American model, comes true, northern Florida by Friday. But if the European model is right, it moves in at a stronger time frame in its life cycle. It moves in towards midweek rather than late in the work week. And it would have a bigger surge too and affect a more populous part of the state. So we're kind of rooting against the European model right now. Here's the GFS model. If the storm does take the American model's path and go straight up into the northern Gulf towards the Panhandle or the Big Bend, it would be a weaker system because it would be feeling the shear, the changing wind with height imparted by the jet stream, which would disrupt its circulation, kind of knock it off kilter, and at the same time, dry air would be entrained into the system, as you see right here, versus the European model says this jet stream a little bit more sharp, a little bit farther north. So as a result, this storm, as we see it pulling in right here, could kind of not really feel that tug-of-war effect yet. Wouldn't be really knocked off kilter and off balance as much. So it would be stronger as it pushed into the Sunshine State. And it wouldn't be until after moving through Florida that it really wrapped in and entrained that dry air, which would erode its circulation. So if you live in Fort Myers, if you live in Naples, Immokalee, Cape Coral, up and down I-4, if you live in this part of the state, Tampa Bay, you know, the Caloosahatchee River, anyone in this part of the state, you're in the orange right now, which just basically means about a 40-50% chance of tropical storm force winds, so sustained winds around 39-ish miles an hour. So in this part of the state, it's time to bring in the lawn flamingos just in case. You don't have to do any crazy doomsday preparation, but just anyone in the yellow, watch that. You know, a lawn flamingo is cute and nice, but if it's whipping at you at 40 miles an hour, it's suddenly not that cute. Same thing with the real flamingo too. Believe me, I've dodged a couple on the roadway. But regardless, you want to make sure that if you're in this area, you're just kind of watching this. Because we don't know landfall yet, we can't have any evacuations, we're not issuing warnings yet, that will come in about 48 hours time. We already have a watch-in effect for the Keys because there's that chance of tropical storm force winds within 48 hours of now. But I think as we head towards like tomorrow night, Mike, into early Tuesday morning, we'll see watches and warnings begin to reach parts of Florida when we have a better idea as to where this storm will ultimately go.
Totally. Looking like a paint by number here in the next couple of days. We got some folks on YouTube. I see you, Roger, asking about Jamaica. Big shout out to Jamaica. I've got the wind layer turned on here in the app. Again, you can go to the layers menu there. It looks like the stack of cards. And in the winds, you can turn on surface winds, the jet stream, which is, of course, the air upstairs. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But there's Jamaica, again, outside of the cone, dealing with a lot of heavy rain right now, but those winds coming in from the southeast, again, likely to be fairly strong at this point as the real quote-unquote center of this storm. It doesn't have one necessarily, but you can see, of course, that counterclockwise rotation and spin. So you're dealing with a lot of heavy rain and, of course, potentially some coastal flooding in Jamaica there, Roger, so stay safe. Again, a ton of comments here coming in. Be sure, if you are watching us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Twitch, big shout out to the folks watching on Twitch. Get your questions in. Cappucci and I will keep going here for as long as necessary here, and we will try our best to answer all of your questions. Seen a lot of people talking about that they don't have their supplies yet. Some people do. Again, food, water. Again, that food, make sure it's non-perishable. Potentially, or expect rather, for power to be gone upwards of 3 days if you were to take any kind of hit. Again, make sure that those supplies are in some kind of waterproof container, especially if you live coastally. And again, this is definitely the time to prepare. You have plenty of time before this is to work its way northward. Cappucci, I want to talk about something that we have spoken about. I'm seeing people in the comments talking about. Of course, we have all of these, the variation of the models, right? We have the GFS, the European, the Canadian, the Japanese model. I mean, there are a ton of them, right? But when it comes to, oh, he's right behind me there.
There's I didn't know if I was supposed to sneak up. Hey.
So when it comes to this quote-unquote, again, trough, I mean, I shouldn't say quote-unquote, we know what we're talking about, but when we turn on the fronts layer here, let's take a look at this trough. I know you were showing the vorticity here.
Yeah.
But again, this is really what all of the models are using to kind of dictate guidance here over these next couple of days. The European showing that trough to arrive a little bit early. When I say trough, you know, farm animals, like a U shape, eating out of a trough or drinking out of a trough. So there is, you can see it right in there, all that cool air from Canada sinking southward into the Gulf states. Right now, again, this front is kind of the leading edge of it. Cappucci was showing you the vorticity there when we're looking at spin. But again, this is that trough that really is going to dictate that. The Plinko example was great. Big shout out to The Price is Right. Big Bob Barker fan here. But with that trough dictating where this thing goes, the GFS has it showing up a little bit later, the Euro has it showing up a little bit sooner, and ultimately, once that trough arrives, it should, again, begin to turn this thing eastward, and that will tell a lot for the impacts up and down the eastern coastline of the U.S.
I think everyone should kind of collectively be rooting on this cool, dry air because, hey, you know, it's getting to be fall. We like fall.
We're in Florida, man. Cool, dry air is wonderful.
Well, we desperately want all this air up here. You notice the wind barbs out of the northwest. We want that air to slosh south and east, but here's the thing. If the cool, dry air gets here sooner, it'll kind of knock the heels out from underneath this tropical cyclone as it is. So really, you know, everyone wants either the feel of fall or to weaken the hurricane. So I think we're all kind of rooting on this. But Mike, you know, doing a great job sort of pointing out where this boundary is. And you can see behind it, you know, look in Oklahoma, for example, winds out of the north behind it, whereas off to the south, we get winds out of the south. So, you know, these boundaries, these fall cold fronts can be big players when it comes to steering currents with tropical cyclones. Ordinarily, we see a curvature ahead of the cold fronts, so eventually this will kind of work up the coastline. You know, Mike, one thing that I want to key in on too, you know, we see the cold front up here. I think this cold front will kind of get hung up over the southern Appalachians and eventually the Carolinas too, whereas the cone is looking like this. We could have eventually moisture reach parts of the, kind of stream up and move along the cold front, which would cause something called a predecessor rain event too, which could be something to watch down the road in the Carolinas. But with that, I will make sure my audio is good, and I know we have a lot we're tracking, Mike.
Yes, I mean, this is a rapidly evolving situation. So again, be sure that you are doing your preps now. I'm seeing some folks in the comments that they're going to go out and get beer and Slim Jims. I mean, hey, if that's what you want during the course of the hurricane, hey, go for it. Or tropical storm coverage. Again, food and water are going to be probably the most important when it comes to those supplies. Batteries, of course, as well. I showed you before, but I'll show it again. Of course, these mobile power banks. I mean, hey, it's 2022. A lot of devices are USB powered, right? So you can charge up your phone, your computer. If you do happen to lose power, well, you can still check the MyRadar app as long as you have cellular connectivity, of course. But you can check the MyRadar app to see where this thing is. You can even turn on the power outages layer to see if your communities around you are losing power, a great indication of, again, those stronger winds, especially, again, with the heavy rainfall. So we got a lot of folks here in the chat asking about storm surge. We have a great animation up on our YouTube channel and in the app that Erica voiced. I highly suggest that you check it out. But of course, storm surge, we're talking about water being pushed inland that wasn't there previously. And Cappucci, that is a real danger. Of course, flooding, the #1 killer when it comes to natural disasters. The power of water is not something to be messed with. So it just goes to that example you brought up earlier, that don't get caught up in the classification of this storm. Wind is only a really small part of the story. Remember, we just had Tropical Storm Fiona become a Cat 1 as it worked its way through Puerto Rico, and look at the damage that it left behind. Of course, rain runs downhill, right? A very mountainous island. So again, all of that rain rushing downhill, again, on the lower end of the classification, but you can't get caught up in that because the power of water and Mother Nature is really fickle. So you need to, again, be sure that you are prepared. So again, let's chat about storm surge, Cappucci, because again, as this works its way beyond Cuba, as it rapidly intensifies here over the coming days, that storm surge really going to be a major player, let alone for the people along western Florida, but all the way and along the Gulf Coast states, including Mississippi, Alabama, and potentially as far west as New Orleans as well.
Yeah, definitely. You know, the shape of the continental shelf, when we talk about sort of the shape of the seafloor right off the Gulf Coast, is very shallow and gradually sloping. What that means is, picture, for example, you're helping move a neighbor into their apartment. You have a moving van out back, and you got this ramp coming out the moving van. If the ramp is short and like this, you're going to have a really tough time, no matter how strong you are, pushing something up on a dolly up the moving ramp. But if you have a really long ramp that's kind of sloping very gently, it is way easier to push something up on that dolly, get in the back of the truck. Same exact thing here, okay? The slope of the continental shelf in the Gulf of Mexico is very gradual, very smooth, very well sloped, very, kind of gently sloped. And as a result, it is way easier for even a lower end hurricane or a high end tropical storm to push water towards the coastline, especially near the Big Bend of Florida. So I think that's the reason why storm surge could be sort of the main headline with this, at least stateside, versus wind or the other impacts. Not to discount wind, but I think people oftentimes undervalue storm surge and really recognize how significant storm surge can be because they get so fixated on the category of a storm, which only connotes how strong the winds will be. The Saffir-Simpson scale, it served its purpose, but ultimately it doesn't do a good job communicating what the biggest impacts from a tropical cyclone are, which are usually when it comes to flooding, both freshwater and, of course, with storm surge near the coastline. We always tell folks, hide from the wind, but run from the water. There's no place safe if you are in an area that will be inundated by storm surge. In parts of Cuba, for example, they're expecting storm surge up here like 9 to 14 feet above ordinarily dry ground, which means if you live 10 feet above sea level there, suddenly you're underwater. So very problematic concern for them too. We don't know yet what the storm surge will be when this thing arrives stateside. One thing to note though, even though the storm will likely be weakening on approach to the U.S., it'll be having a broader wind field. Its wind field will be expanding, covering more real estate, which sometimes can be more efficient for pushing water ashore, more effective than a more narrow, concentrated area of stronger winds. So again, something we have to watch with that there. So we'll do a real sort of recap of where this storm is right now. One thing I'm noticing, even in the past few satellite scans, this thing is beginning to look a little more organized. Notice this convective burst. I want you to watch this right here. So this one big thunderstorm does something kind of interesting. So it starts to fire. The center is likely right here. But it starts to fire, then look, a new one fires here, a new one fires here towards the end of the loop. If we can watch that really closely right over here, and actually I may step off screen real quick just to see if we can zoom in on that feature, because I think this is kind of worth pointing out really well. Watch this actually be the last sort of And again, bear with us, we're kind of doing things on the fly. We'll watch only the last hour, okay? So watch what happens right here. This thing, big old bubble of convection, so thunderstorm activity. Purple means the highest, coolest, tallest cloud tops. But then look, we have one here, then we have one here, then we have one here. That tells me that this is kind of the first step of trying to pinch off an eye or pinch off a center of circulation and begin to form some kind of semi-continuous ring of thunderstorm activity around it, which would eventually metastasize into a developing nascent eye wall. So it's kind of cool to see, really, in real time, the past half hour since we've started the stream, we're noticing that start to take place with these hut towers orbiting around a common center. So Mike, I do think we're seeing a center form right here. And here's the thing too, this storm is still rather weak, in quotation marks, 45 miles an hour. It'll be way stronger down the road. But the reason I say this is kind of crucial, if the center is vertically stretched by this ring of convection or thunderstorm activity, which has updrafts, if that surface vortex is stretched vertically, suddenly the storm has a pillar of vorticity or spin around which it can construct itself. That's what we're likely beginning to see right there. Oh, wow, this does a great job of showing that too, okay? So we'll zoom in a little bit just so we can again point out that feature. So notice, by the way, this is the GOES East weather satellite peering down from about 22,234 miles above Earth. It'll take a second to catch up, okay? So again, this looks a little bit messy. What you're seeing, here's the center, it's exposed, but then look, all these thunderstorms form along it. Again, here's the center, we back up a little bit, and then look, bam, 1, 2, 3 individual thunderstorms forming kind of and wrapping around it really impressively. The reason it looks different towards the end of the shot, just because the sun is going down, this is visible satellite imagery, but actually I'm going to pivot this north just a little bit. Thanks.
Gotcha.
See, one step ahead of me. I
Team
love the
coverage,
teamwork.
we
Yep.
gotcha.
So again, this loop will take just a second to load. When it does, here's the center, kind of working north, and then bam, all these thunderstorms really wrapping around. So kind of a pivotal moment in its life cycle. So the National Hurricane Center sort of coordinated with the Air Force earlier on. They flew an airplane, an aircraft reconnaissance mission into the storm, and they found this general circulation. We just showed you why we think that the center is actually forming right now, but we found a kind of lower air pressure in the middle too. What that means is there's less air in the middle of the storm than on the outside. That's what spurs winds to begin with. Wind is just air moving from an area of higher pressure to low pressure. Picture what happened if the Hoover Dam was to break, for example. Water would go from water pressure higher, meaning there's a lot more water on one side, to where the water pressure is lower, i.e. no water. Same thing if you had a fish tank and you put like a partition in the middle, sucked out water from one side, lift up partition, the water sloshes and tries to even out. Same thing with air pressure. So if we have kind of air being lifted in the middle and there being less air in general, that void, that missing air, eventually air tries to rush in to fuel that. So with the strongest hurricanes, you might be missing 10 to almost 12% of the atmosphere's ambient mass towards the inside of the storm, which has a vacuum-like effect. Why does that not immediately fill in? Well, as the air is rushing in towards the eye, it's also swirling around. So the centrifugal force is pushing it outwards at exactly the same rate it's trying to slosh inwards. So the strongest hurricanes are in a very elegant scientific balance called cyclostrophic balance, where the inward pressure gradient force is balanced by the outward centrifugal force. Cool to think about, but also it shows you how many elements have to come together perfectly to make a strong hurricane. And unfortunately, we will see that in the Caribbean. Lesser chance of that impacting Florida. Could still be a significant system, but a lesser impact chance of a major hurricane. But Cuba is set to get smacked tomorrow by a very high-end hurricane, Category 3 or Category 4. Water temperatures like 85 to 90 degrees will support rapid intensification. The other cool thing too, we've been talking about this upper level high around this surface low. So the surface low is our developing tropical storm. The actual air pressure is already lower than what this model is simulating. But notice, so hurricanes in the northern hemisphere spin counterclockwise. There's clockwise flow around this. Why is that a good thing for the hurricane and a bad thing for us? Well, here's the thing. We talked about moments ago how air flows into a hurricane counterclockwise at the surface, goes up the eye wall, and then eventually expands and radiates outward clockwise, kind of unwinding, so to speak. So this clockwise flow around the hurricane at the high altitudes will assist in that unwinding process, helping to evacuate outflow or exhaust air away from the storm. And the more that goes away at the top, the more the storm can suck in at the bottom, and that air at the bottom is in contact with the warm, moist sea surface, and that will really just kind of help foster further intensification. Picture if you were to put a fan and suck air away from the top of a chimney. The more air that goes out, the more air that rushes in at bottom and tries to fuel that fire even more and really fan the flames. So it's kind of what's happening with this system. So putting things into motion, storm's kind of getting organized early tomorrow morning. Here's 5 a.m. Notice it really consolidates throughout the day, a couple spiral rain bands feeding into it, but really conditions go downhill markedly around sunset tomorrow night in west central Cuba. And then look, the eye wall begins to really come together. The eye wall is that spinning donut of extreme winds. Outside the eye wall, likely gusts of like 80, 85 miles an hour. Inside the eye wall, abruptly, wind gusts to 110, 120. Inner eye wall, gusts to about 130, 135 upon landfall. Inside the eye, next to nothing. The strongest hurricanes have the most fierce eye walls and the greatest dearth of wind inside the middle, kind of an oasis of calm conditions. Being inside the eye of a hurricane, and I've been in the eye of a couple hurricanes. Mike, I don't know how many you've been in, but I imagine a couple too. It's, excuse me, such a weird place to be in because you can look all around you. You know you're surrounded by fury, but you're in this tiny ring of calm, which is so bizarre to see. Anyway, this moves across Cuba. Keep in mind, Cuba's only like 40 or 50 miles south and north, so it can kind of charge on and doesn't really feel the effects of land, doesn't weaken all that much, and then just re-strengthens again Tuesday afternoon in the Gulf of Mexico, where water temperatures are again near 90 degrees. So we're expecting this storm to move over western Cuba. Then what does it do from there? Well, some models say it goes into the northern Gulf of Mexico, moving towards the Big Bend or eventually the Panhandle. Others suggest it takes a right-hand turn into western Florida. The fact that we're only about 3-ish days out from whatever potential Florida impact there would be, and we're still not being able to sort of pin this down after, say, 72 hours, is a big-time signal of how much uncertainty there is with this system. The reason being why? Well, we know the dominant feature in the atmosphere steering this thing is a trough, or a deep in the jet stream over the eastern U.S. This trough, within which is nestled cool air, low pressure, and spin at high altitudes, is flanked by this dip in the jet stream. Again, strong winds aloft. Now, that's kind of the steering current to sort of pull this thing along. The American GFS model says our hurricane, right down here, does not feel the pull from this and keeps going north, at which point it runs into dry air and too much chaotic wind aloft to keep it going, and rapidly weakens upon landfall in the northern Gulf of Mexico, whereas the European model says this thing starts getting tugged east a little sooner, moves into western Florida, and eventually impacts Florida as a stronger hurricane. Both models suggest that dry air will be working down thanks to this northerly component of the jet streams to kind of cool dry air working in from Canada, push down towards the Gulf Coast eventually. Could be entrained in the system, especially if it takes that more northerly track that the American GFS is simulating. So ultimately, I'm expecting rapid weakening of the wind with the system by the time it makes landfall, if it does make landfall in the Panhandle or the Big Bend. But the other thing to note there, even if the winds rapidly strengthen, that storm has to unload all its moisture, so very heavy rainfall. You might get a couple of rotating thunderstorms as the storm makes landfall, because of course, hurricanes have so much spin left with them too. And we talked about that storm surge threat. The northeastern Gulf, again, the continental shelf slopes very gently, so it's very easy to push a lot of water against the coastline. So Mike, a multifaceted threat. Anyone in this area, though, that's kind of shaded right now with anything like orange or worse, you're really going to be watching this closely because it's something we'll be talking more about in the days ahead. But ultimately, with the forecast that is uncertain, it just means check back for frequent updates because something is going to happen. We just don't know who will see the worst yet.
100%. Bear in mind, I'm seeing a ton of people in the chat here. Please understand that we are not overhyping anything. We are not trying to get you scared. We are simply trying to present to you the information that we are seeing. Keep that in mind. Now, again, for people that have just joined us here in the chat, we've been going for almost an hour, Cappucci, but we're going to keep going for about an hour or so because we have got to get prepared for the next live hit into the evening. Of course, be sure that you got your notifications turned on. If you're watching on YouTube, click on that subscribe button. The thumbs up as well. Like the video. It really helps us out a lot with the YouTube algorithm. And, of course, click on that notification bell as well. That way you always know whenever we post a video or, of course, whenever we go live as well, which is coming up at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I should also mention, Mr. Cappucci, we've had a ton of DMs come in on Twitter. If you missed this, head to our Twitter account at MyRadarWX and send us a DM. You got to follow us, but follow us, send us a DM, let us know where you're watching from. I'm seeing a ton of people watching us from all around the country, which is awesome. And we're going to be giving away Cappucci's book, Looking Up the True Adventures of a Storm-Chasing Weather Nerd. There he is.
I highly recommend. It's a good book.
Go figure. So be sure to follow us on Twitter. Send us a DM. May or may not be autographed. I won't tell you. You'll have to wait and see for the book to arrive where you live. So again, be sure to follow us on Twitter at MyRadarWX on Twitter. Send us a DM. All right. So we're going to be live for about another 10 or so minutes. I'm seeing a ton of comments come in, which is really awesome. We are here for you. Keep that in mind. We are here to answer your questions. So get them in now, whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or even on Twitch. Big shout out to the people watching us on Twitch. All right, so let's look at some of these questions here. People asking about the Space Coast. Of course, breaking news, the NASA Artemis launch is not happening on Tuesday. That has been pushed, of course, due to Ian and, of course, bad weather. Still, of course, dealing with that potential leak in the rocket in and of itself. We got some people in Melbourne. Again, that's on the east coast of Florida as well. Shout out to the Space Coast. So, Cappucci, let's talk about that. Before we do, though, again, we've got to bring to your attention, this was just a couple of hours ago that this tropical storm watch was issued, highlighted in pink here on the MyRadar app. And again, if you don't know how to turn these on, I will show you right now. Head to the layers menu. It looks like the stack of cards on the toolbar. Go into the watches and warnings layer, and you can turn on that the show watches. You can also fill them in as well. I recommend you do so for an instance like this so you can really get a close look. But bear in mind, I've got the cone turned on as well. You can see just to the west of the Keys as we work our way into the middle of the upcoming work week, just off the western coast of the Florida Keys, a Cat 4 hurricane. I mean, remember, when this thing gets into the Gulf of Mexico, that is some super duper warm water there, and it's going to love that warm water. But again, let's tap on the tropical storm watch. Again, this is out 48 hours ahead of those tropical storm force winds arriving Tuesday morning through Tuesday and into Tuesday evening. In fact, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here.
And Mike, I think real quick, just one thing to emphasize too.
It.
You know, the cone is all the way over here. Look where the watch is, outside the cone. So it's just kind of a reminder for folks that you don't have to live inside the cone to see impacts.
Totally. Bear in mind as well, if you are to divide a tropical cyclone into 4 quadrants there. I think I'm up on camera, Dame, if you want to take me for just a moment here. So if you divide a hurricane into these 4 quadrants here, it's going to be that right front portion of the hurricane where you're likely to find, outside of the eye wall, the strongest winds. And go figure, as Ian passes to the west of the Keys here, you're looking at all of that onshore flow coming in from the southeast, likely to, again, be some of the strongest winds, resulting in the storm surge, heavy rain, and that's typically where in a tropical cyclone, that right front quadrant where you do find that tornadic activity. But again, I'm going to go into the layers menu here, into the hurricane tracker, and we're going to switch it over to the wind speed forecast. I know we were just looking at this, but it's a great feature in the MyRadar app as well, part of the hurricane tracker layer. And again, you can see, if I zoom in just a little bit here, I've got the watches and warnings turned on, and this the wind speed forecast as well. Starting Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. until Tuesday evening around 8 p.m., it is going to be a windy day in the Florida Keys, one of the most beautiful areas in the entire United States, mind you, and they are no strangers to tropical cyclones. Again, Cappucci, let's take a look at a few more of these questions here coming into the chat. Again, I see you jokesters in the chat. Going to put you in timeout real quick.
I want to do that for people in real life.
Gotta love that. Wouldn't that be great, huh?
A mute button for people.
Awesome. We've got somebody watching on YouTube from Gainesville saying, been a MyRadar girl for a very long time. Big shout out to you. We love that. That is really awesome to hear. Again, we have so many users. Every time I'm at the airport or even at the grocery store and I'm wearing a MyRadar shirt, I seemingly run into someone that says, hey, I have your app, which is really cool to see. We got some truck drivers in the chat. Big shout out to the truck drivers. I know that they are paying very close attention to the weather forecast each and every day. We got someone in Lakeland. Let's talk about Central Florida. Of course, Cappucci, that's where we are. We are in Orlando, Florida. That is where the MyRadar studio is. Lakeland, not too far away, about an hour or so away. Central Florida, let me switch back here. We're going to go back to the cone. Of probability here, and we're going to work our way northward. So Central Florida, including the Space Coast, is in the cone of uncertainty, and that is the key word there, uncertainty. It's not to say that the forecasters at the National Hurricane Center don't know what they are doing. Again, they are the tip of the spear, the best of the best. These are the best and the brightest that the meteorological world have to offer when it comes to tropical weather. And again, Orlando is part of that cone. We are still too many days away at this point to really know exactly where where this storm is going. I mean, Cappucci, it just started working its way northward here,
Yeah.
starting to strengthen. It's going to take some time. I'll be curious to see how fast this thing gets going once it really encounters that warm water. But as it works its way closer to western Cuba, that's where we might see some impacts to the larger dynamics at play. But again, for the people that do live in central Florida, I mean, this is where we live, folks. So we are part of this cone as well, stretching from Port Charlotte, Sarasota to Tampa. Again, Lakeland, someone in the chat that was asking about that, you are part of that cone as well. And again, that's toward the end of the work week. At that point, a weakening system down near about a Cat 2, but you cannot get caught up in the category, again, what the storm is being categorized as, because again, as Cappucci said, I'm going to keep saying this here, wind is a really small part of the equation. Might I add, before I toss it back to Mr. Cappucci there, that Dr. David Ruglicki, Mr. Hurricane, if you will be involved with our coverage here over the next couple of days. I mean, he has a meteorological phenomenon named after him, and it relates to hurricanes, the Ruglicki cane. I highly suggest you check out the video on our YouTube channel. Again, it's his namesake. It's really cool. Big shout out to Dr. David. We will have him as part of our coverage here over the next couple of days to really look at the meat and potatoes of this tropical cyclone. But as it stands right now, I've got Mr. Cappucci behind me here. Again, Matt, let's keep going. We've been going for a while now. Matt and I could keep going all night here. We've got Erica waiting in the wings as well. We're putting out, of course, the Spanish language update as well. So big shout out to our bilingual users. But again, Cappucci, let's talk more about the storm surge here, stretching from South Florida all the way into the Big Bend for the people that are just joining us here. Again, don't get caught up in the winds. We are not trying to overhype or underdeliver something here. We are trying to make sure you are prepared. That is the key.
Yeah, definitely. You know, there's a majority chance that the strongest winds do wind up staying offshore. But here's the thing. Even if that's the case, what are they doing? They're blowing over the water. They're pushing the water. Now, the slope of the continental shelf over the northeastern part of the Gulf of Mexico, south of the Panhandle of Florida, south of the Big Bend, is some of the most gently sloping continental shelf. What that means, it's like going up a gentle ramp, a long ramp that slopes very gently. It is way easier to push something up a gentle ramp than a ramp sloped like this. As a result, it's going to be very easy for this storm to push water ashore, primarily east of the center. So again, let's say the storm goes like this, and it's weakening upon landfall in the northern Gulf. Okay, that's all fine and well, but look, it's pushing water into places like Tampa Bay, into the Big Bend, and it's pushing water in areas perpendicular to the direction the water's coming in from. It's kind of a directly onshore flow, which is why even a low-end hurricane, if that is the case, again, we're planning for worse, hoping for the best, but if a low-end hurricane were to make landfall across the northern Gulf, you could still wind up seeing a 4 to 6 foot surge, even with a tropical storm. I think it was Tropical Storm Barry a few years ago, brought a 5-foot storm surge, which was enough to inundate parts of coastal Mississippi and the Mississippi Delta in Louisiana. So really, a concern like that. You know, Mike, one other concern I have actually is for the weather down the road. So actually, if we can take the app once again, I want to pull up that cone and discuss sort of what will be the case long term with this storm after it stops being a hurricane, meaning as it undergoes something called not extratropical transition, but rather it kind of dies a little bit, but in doing so, it still brings other threats. So one thing I want to point out, if I can, I'm going to walk over this way because our mics are going to interfere a little bit.
Real quick, I'm just going to throw this in there. The chat is cracking me up over here. Somebody said, I'm going to stay in the Florida Gators end zone. Nothing ever happens there. Sorry, University of Florida Gator fans out there. A rough loss to Tennessee yesterday, but that comment made me laugh.
I love that. I love that. So, you know, one area we want to focus on is what's going on in Georgia, because of course we alert a lot of folks in Georgia. They have to watch this too. You know, Mike, it's not too often that people in Georgia are paying attention to a tropical system the way they are now, but it's something we really closely have to watch, because here's the thing. Look, you know, on looks like a Thursday with a Category 2 hurricane west of Tampa. This track may shift east a little bit, and it weakens probably into a tropical storm by the time it gets north of the Florida-Georgia border. And you might think, tropical storm, that's not that bad. Winds are way less, right? Well, obviously winds are way less. Most people in Georgia are used to winds of 39 miles an hour. That's not that bad. But the collateral impacts too, like the heavy rainfall, could be an issue, especially because this thing, as it loses its sort of heat from below, will be dropping all of its moisture. So that by the time it gets here into Georgia, you could see serious impacts in terms of flooding. Also, Mike, you know, there's spin at the mid-levels that will kind of keep going and foster some rotating thunderstorms too, especially across the southeast as those remnants move inland. Now, I wanted something kind of unusual here, and we're going to do some drawings. I'm actually going to try taking a screenshot if I can, and we are going to go and annotate that and talk about something. Oh no, I turned it off. Mike, if you wouldn't mind to help me real quick.
I gotcha.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that.
Don't know if we're going to be able to do that at least, but let's get it back up.
Is there
here.
a way to take a screenshot and then switch in the photos and annotate?
Yeah,
How does one take
Damien, yeah, leave it. Throw up the graphics here. We'll take a screenshot. I've got this big case on here to make sure that if we were to drop this thing on the floor, that it would not get damaged. So stand by here. We'll try to take a screenshot.
Beautiful.
There we go. All right. Should still be able to see it, Damien, right? I think so.
Awesome. I am loving this. Okay, so here's what we are going to do. We're going to actually do some painting and stuff, okay? So let's say, for example, of course, here's where all the moisture is riding up in terms of especially being east of the center. Winds are out of the south, so moisture will be riding north like this. This will be like a moisture conveyor belt you see me drawing right there.
Meteorological John Madden at work, folks.
I love it. At the same time, we get this jet stream dip. You can already see kind of the air flowing down like this, so dry air like this. So all this, this is dry up here, okay? There's going to be a dip in the jet stream. What color should we make that? Let's make that white. We'll make the jet stream white, and the jet stream is going to dip like this, okay? It's going to dip like this, somewhere in here. So, Mike, of course, that means we got a cold front shaped like this, where the cool, dry air is pushing southeast. So again, cold front like this. I am not the best artist. I'm not Bob Ross, but here's what this means. When we have moisture pooling along a cold front, that sets up a very narrow area, especially tropical moisture, where you can get a lot of rainfall, especially when you have venting from the jet stream aloft. We're not sure where this will be, but someone in this area could see what we call a or a predecessor rain event. What that means, you don't have to be anywhere near the tropical cyclone to see the effects of this predecessor rain event. In fact, you have to be closer to the cold front, where there'll be jet stream venting aloft, and moisture from that tropical system will be kind of preceding the actual storm itself and pulling along the front. So someone could see like a foot or more of rain if this winds up verifying. The midday and the afternoon GFS models, the American model, both simulated that predecessor rain event as being a big concern. So really, for Georgia and the Carolinas, I don't want to rule out them seeing a more significant impact, because ultimately, Mike, if I had to choose between tropical storm force winds of 39 miles an hour or a foot and a half of rainfall, I choose the wind. So it really goes to show you, even outside of the cone, or even the northern periphery of the cone, far from the Gulf of Mexico, there can still be impacts. So that's why, if we take me back full screen once again, that's why if you're way up here, the winds might not be as bad, but flooding is potential all the way up in the Carolinas.
Right. I mean, if you've ever dealt with a flash flood after a heavy rain, or in the midst of a heavy rain, I should say, again, water is not fun to deal with, at least in my experience. Fire and water, I mean, man, they are not to be messed with. And again, flooding, at least inland flooding, is the #1 killer when it comes to natural disasters. Not a tornado or anything like that. It's flooding, folks. So again, something to be taken seriously in that respect. We're probably going to wrap things up here in a minute. Cappucci, we've been going on almost an hour, about 110 minutes here.
Wow.
We've got to prepare for the next stream coming up here. Again, we'll add in a few more comments here before we say goodbye. Again, this guy behind me here, if he's on camera, there he is, over whatever side it is. He could probably continue to go, on and on and on and on here. We love it. Of course, we love interacting with you guys. For those of you watching on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, LinkedIn, Twitter, we're live everywhere. We're in the app, of course, as well. I'd be remiss to mention that. So again, if you're new around here and you're watching us on YouTube, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that thumbs up button. It really helps us break through the YouTube algorithm. And if you are not subscribed, well, hey, that's totally free. Subscribe to the channel and click on that notification bell. That way you always know whenever we drop a new video, or of course, whenever we go live as well, which is coming up at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time later this evening. We'll be going live all the rest of this week as well, as Tropical Storm Ian intensifies and works its way northward through the Gulf of Mexico. So again, we're going to wrap things up. I see you, Sandy Rose, in the comments. Big shout out to Sandy Rose, one of MyRadar's biggest supporters out there. Awesome. Again, be sure to subscribe on YouTube if you're not already. I'll mention one more time here before we wrap things up here in just a moment. Go to our Twitter account, MyRadarWX. Be sure that you're following us. That's part of this. Send us a DM. Let us know where you're watching. Again, a direct message. Slide into our DMs and let us know where you're watching from. And we're going to be giving away a copy of Matthew Cappucci's book. He's behind me there.
I'm checking the DMs. We got a lot of people writing in, so keep writing.
Yes. Looking up the true adventures of a storm-chasing weather nerd may or may not be autographed, but the winner will only know that. Again, the way to win that book is to go to our Twitter account, follow us on Twitter, send us a DM, let us know where you're watching from. I see you chucking traffic on YouTube. It is at MyRadarWX. I think it's right over top of my head, right up there, at MyRadarWX. So again, we'll give you guys some final thoughts here before we wrap things up. I'm seeing a ton of people here in the chat asking again about storm surge, where it's going. We've certainly covered that again and again, but we are going to continue to do so as the evening rolls on, and of course, for the rest of the week here. And again, I would be remiss if I did not shout out our amazing crew behind the scenes. We've got Damien and Jack behind the scenes pulling the strings. Matt will be in this week as well. It's full team coverage here at MyRadar, and again, the unsung heroes of the team, let alone the software developers, because we love them as well, but the folks behind all of the media streaming, Damien directing things again with Jack back there too. Big shout out to those guys. Let us know, or give them some love, I should say, in the comments. Again, big shout out to Damien and Jack. All right, Cappucci, some final thoughts here as we wrap things up. People are asking if it's going to make landfall as a Cat 1, as a Cat 2, where it's going. Let's, again, look at the cone here into the MyRadar app. I've got the winds turned on as well. So let's turn those winds off real quick here. Bear in mind. That's my favorite thing about the app. I'm not just saying this because, of course, I work for MyRadar. I imagine the app almost like a candy store, right, where you can go in and there's so much stuff that you can choose from. You can really make the experience what you want, whether it be with the wildfires, the orbital tracking layer, if you want to watch a satellite go overhead, and so much exciting stuff coming down the pipeline. Again, big shout out to the developers. But again, let's look at the cone here. A tropical storm watch in effect for the Florida Keys, especially so as we get into Tuesday, as the center of this storm is off the western coast of the Florida Keys. Still plenty of time for this to change, mind you. I have to put that in there. But again, as we see this storm, again, Ian, work its way northward, a weakening anticipated from the major status, which is Cat 3 and above, down to a Cat 2 hurricane, making landfall, at least as it stands right now in the current cone from the NHC, making landfall near the Big Bend and tracking its way northeastward into southern Georgia toward South Carolina as a tropical storm. So again, Cappucci, your final thoughts before we say goodbye.
Should, of course, be concerned. They should be watching this because ultimately, if we don't necessarily know where it's going to impact in Florida yet, most folks at home probably don't either. So that's why, we hate telling folks to stay tuned, but really this is one of those occasions where confidence is lower than usual. We have to tell people to keep watching this, take it seriously. There will be fluctuations. The other thing too, of course, don't focus on the category of the storm. I don't care if it's a Cat 1, a Cat 4, a Cat whatever, because if your local impacts vary other than just wind, that's what you should be paying close attention to. So I really say take stock of what your biggest hazard will be. Do you live near a brook that could overflow if you get heavy rainfall? Are you in an area that doesn't have basements if you get underneath a tropical tornado? Are you in an area that's subject to storm surge, even if the winds aren't that bad? All those different things. People need to base their preparations on what the biggest hazard facing them is, which is not a universal thing. The Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale only rates based on wind. It is a flawed metric. It is not an impact scale. It is a technical classification that has become mainstream, which there are problems with it. But that's why we say, run from the water, hide from the wind, but ultimately, pay attention to this one, because anytime in September, when you have a storm in the Gulf of Mexico under crazy warm water temperatures, you got to live in a heightened state of awareness, Mike.
100%. I mean, this is, it's hurricane season, right? I mean, this is to be expected each and every year. It's been a relatively quiet season up to this point. But again, there's the knock on wood, I think. Mother Nature, again, is very fickle. So you need to be prepared. Now is the time to do so, especially for the folks that live and around the Gulf Coast. That stretches all the way from the Florida Keys, all the way westward up toward Louisiana and the southern coastline of Louisiana. Again, anticipating a potential landfall here over western Cuba. We will know a lot as we work our way over the next day or so. But again, we just continue to monitor things. Of course, the National Hurricane Center, they are the best of the best, and we will be relaying that cone and the latest information as we have it. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, now's a great time to subscribe and click on that notification bell, especially so that way you know when we go live later this evening. We'll be around 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. That's when the cone comes out from the National Hurricane Center, or at least the big update from the NHC as we head into the overnight hours there. So again, be sure that you are subscribed to the channel. One more quick thing. I guess a few more quick things. I've mentioned this again. We're giving away a copy of Cappucci's book, Looking Up, The True Adventures of a Storm-Chasing Weather Nerd. Head to our Twitter. It's just above my head there, at MyRadarWX. Send us a direct message, slide into those DMs, and let us know where you are watching from. We'll pick one lucky winner, and hey, the book might be autographed, but only the winner's going to know that, of course.
Hey, if you slide in my DMs, I can guarantee you an autograph.
Yeah, I mean, he's great at that. I mean, I think he might answer all of his DMs, so hit him up on Twitter.
For better or for worse, but they're definitely entertaining.
There it is. All right, so again, we thank you all for watching us this evening. We could really keep going here, but we've got to get prepped for the next live hit. Again, big shout out to all of our viewers here on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn, and of course, in the MyRadar app. I'd be remiss, of course, to if I didn't mention, download the MyRadar app. It's totally free. Now is a great time to do so to make sure that you have the latest information. You can track everything that's happening as it develops. And we have got to show this. Again, this is really, really cool. Damien and I went to the roof not too long ago and put a camera on the roof of the building. It's not too often that we are live at this time of the evening to be able to show this. You are looking at a live shot of Orlando, Florida. It looks like we just missed the sunrise there, but you can see the Amway Center there in the back portion of the shot. I'm so pumped that we get to show this camera, Damien.
That's
this
pretty.
is great. This was difficult to do, but there is the camera. Again, thank you to Damien, of course, the behind-the-scenes crew, the unsung heroes of the MyRadar team. So that's going to do it for this live hit. Again, we will be live coming up later this evening at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We also, as the week goes on, are going to have coverage from storm chaser Aaron Jajak. That guy has been working his butt off. He's been up covering Fiona and Nova Scotia. I mean, Cappucci, a record-setting storm for Canada. I mean, again, not looking at the category of what that storm is, but again, the low pressure of it. Again, we can really nerd out here, folks, but I suggest that you go to Aaron's Twitter feed, at Aaron Jajak. Check out his videos there. I mean, truly remarkable scene up there in portions of Eastern Canada. Aaron's going to be hopping on a plane and flying down to Florida into tomorrow evening, so he will be watching landfall wherever this thing goes. And of course, we will have coverage from Dr. David Roglicki, Mr. Hurricane. We'll wonder if we can make that nickname stick. Big shout out to Dr. David. He's going to be joining us here over the next couple of days, too, to break down all of the major dynamics at play with Ian as it develops and heads northward. All right, so for meteorologist Matthew Cappucci, I have been meteorologist Mike Linden. We hope you stay safe and stay dry. We'll catch you back here in the next one. See ya.